The waiting did not last long, but it stretched in a way that made minutes feel uncertain, as if time itself had loosened its structure in this place. Carl remained seated, the canteen still resting in his hands, his fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of the cap as he watched the movement around him. The line had shifted again, some men now standing, others being directed toward a set of rail cars positioned a short distance away. He followed the motion with his eyes, expecting at any moment for something to change, for the calm to break and reveal what had been promised. It did not. A soldier approached, not hurried, not slow, just walking with purpose that did not feel directed at anyone in particular. He stopped a few feet from Carl and gestured lightly with his hand. Up. The word was neither sharp nor soft. It simply existed. Carl stood immediately, his body responding out of habit, but his mind lagged behind, still searching for the pattern that would make sense of all this. They were guided toward the rail cars, and Carl noticed the details before he could stop himself. The doors were open wide. Sunlight reached inside, illuminating rows of seats. Seats. Not empty space. Not bare floors. Cushioned seats, worn but intact, arranged in pairs facing forward. He slowed without meaning to, just enough to take it in, before the man behind him stepped lightly into his back, not pushing, just reminding him to keep moving. Inside, the air felt warmer, touched by the sun, carrying a faint scent of fabric and something clean, something maintained. Carl stepped down the narrow aisle and chose a seat near the window, lowering himself carefully as if testing whether it was real. The cushion gave beneath his weight. Soft. Not much, but enough to register. Across from him, another prisoner sat down and ran his hand along the armrest, fingers moving slowly, as if confirming texture. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary, maybe even dangerous, in a place that refused to behave as expected. The train had not started yet. Outside, soldiers moved along the platform, checking something against their papers, occasionally glancing toward the cars but never staring, never watching in the way guards were supposed to watch. One of them paused near Carl's window, adjusting the strap on his shoulder, then leaned slightly to speak to another soldier just out of view. Their voices were low, casual, the tone of men discussing something routine, something that did not involve the people sitting just feet away. Carl turned his head slightly, looking out through the glass. The world beyond the platform stretched farther than he anticipated. Green fields. Trees standing full, untouched. A road in the distance where a car passed, moving steadily, not rushed, not cautious. Just moving. He felt it again, that pressure inside his chest, not fear, not exactly, but something that made it harder to breathe normally. The door at the end of the car closed with a solid click, followed by another further down. The sound echoed briefly, then settled into the quiet. A moment later, the train shifted, a subtle movement at first, then a steady pull forward. Carl did not look away from the window. The platform began to slide past, slowly, then faster, carrying with it the soldiers, the buildings, the edges of everything he had just stepped into. As they moved beyond the dock, the view opened wider, the horizon stretching out in a way that felt almost excessive. No destruction. No interruption. Just distance filled with life that had not been broken. He watched as a group of children appeared near a fence line, their figures small but clear enough to see their movement. One of them noticed the train and lifted an arm, waving without hesitation, without uncertainty. The gesture was simple. Instinctive. Carl did not move at first. He stared, waiting for the moment to shift, for someone to pull the child back, to correct the mistake. No one did. The child kept waving. After a second that felt longer than it should have, Carl raised his hand, just slightly, the motion hesitant, almost hidden. The child waved again, as if that was enough, as if that was normal. Carl lowered his hand slowly, his eyes still fixed on the fading figures as the train carried him further into a place that no longer matched anything he had been taught to expect. The rhythm of the train settled into something steady, something almost hypnotic, the soft clatter of wheels against the track repeating over and over until it no longer sounded like movement, but like time itself passing in measured intervals. Carl remained by the window, his shoulder barely touching the cool glass, eyes fixed on the landscape as it unfolded without interruption. Fields stretched for miles, uninterrupted by shell craters or broken fences, the grass thick and even, shifting gently in the wind like it had never been disturbed. Every so often, a farmhouse appeared in the distance, painted white or pale yellow, with a porch that wrapped around the front and a roof that held its shape perfectly against the sky. He watched one pass by slowly, noticing details he had not expected to matter. A line of laundry hanging between two posts. A dog lying in the shade, unmoving except for the rise and fall of its chest. A man stepping out onto the porch, lifting a hand to shield his eyes as the train moved past. No alarm. No urgency. Just curiosity. Inside the car, the men remained quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tight or defensive. It had softened, stretched thin by the steady evidence outside the windows. Across from Carl, the same prisoner who had touched the armrest earlier now leaned slightly forward, elbows on his knees, staring out with an expression that no longer looked guarded, but searching. As if he was trying to find the moment where this would all stop making sense. The train continued, passing through small towns that appeared and disappeared in seconds, each one complete, each one functioning. Stores with signs hanging above the doors. Cars parked at angles along the street. People walking, talking, carrying things in their hands as if their lives had not been interrupted at all. Carl noticed a woman pushing a small cart along the sidewalk, her movement unhurried, her attention focused entirely on the path ahead of her. No one looked up in fear. No one hid. The world outside did not react to the train in the way he had imagined. It acknowledged it, briefly, then returned to itself. A soldier moved down the aisle, his boots quiet against the floor, pausing every few rows to glance at the men seated there. When he reached Carl, he stopped for a second, just long enough to rest his hand against the top of the seat in front of him. "You doing all right?" he asked, the words simple, direct, spoken in a tone that did not assume anything. Carl looked up, caught off guard by the question more than the presence of the man himself. He did not answer immediately. The idea that an answer was expected felt unfamiliar. The soldier did not repeat himself. He just waited, his posture relaxed, his attention steady but not demanding. Carl nodded once. It was the only response he could form. The soldier nodded back, as if that was sufficient, then moved on without another word. No inspection. No correction. Just a brief exchange that left no clear purpose behind. Carl turned back to the window, but the image outside had shifted again, not in what he saw, but in how he saw it. The fields were still there. The houses still stood. The people still moved through their lives without hesitation. But now there was something else layered beneath it all, something quieter, harder to define. The absence of what he had expected had become its own presence, filling the space where fear should have been. He pressed his fingers lightly against the glass, feeling the faint vibration of the train moving forward, carrying him deeper into a place that did not need to prove anything, did not need to explain itself. And for the first time since stepping onto the dock, Carl realized that the confusion was no longer coming from what he was seeing, but from everything he had believed before he saw it. The train did not slow for a long time, and when it finally did, the change was so gradual it felt almost imagined, the rhythm beneath Carl's feet softening, the steady pull easing into something quieter, more deliberate. He leaned slightly forward, his gaze sharpening as the landscape outside began to shift again, fields giving way to structures that stood closer together, roads intersecting at clean angles, fences giving way to open yards where people moved without hesitation. The train curved gently, and for a moment, the angle of the window caught the reflection of the men inside, their faces layered faintly over the world beyond. Carl saw himself there, thin, still, his expression caught somewhere between alertness and disbelief. He looked away. The train rolled past a small platform, not a station in the way he understood it, but a place where a few people stood waiting, some holding small bags, others simply watching as the cars passed by. One man lifted his hat slightly, not in salute, not in mockery, just a gesture of acknowledgement, as if the train was part of the day like anything else. Carl followed the motion until it disappeared behind them. The train slowed further, the sound of the wheels shifting into a lower tone, until finally it came to a stop with a soft, controlled jolt that barely moved the men in their seats. No shouted commands followed. No immediate rush. The doors remained closed for a moment, and in that pause, Carl felt something unfamiliar settle over him, not tension, but anticipation without fear. Then the latch released with a clean click, and the door at the end of the car opened inward. Light entered first, followed by the outline of a soldier standing in the doorway, his figure framed against the brightness outside. "All right," he said, his voice even, carrying just enough to reach the length of the car without effort. "Let us go." The phrasing struck Carl immediately. Not an order thrown at them, but something closer to an invitation, or at least something that did not demand force to be understood. The men stood, one by one, moving into the aisle with the same disciplined rhythm they had carried across continents. But now that rhythm felt slightly altered, less rigid, less driven by fear of consequence. Carl stepped forward with the others, his hand brushing lightly against the back of a seat as he moved, grounding himself in the physical world around him. When he reached the door, he paused just long enough to adjust his footing before stepping down onto solid ground again. The surface beneath his boots was gravel, compact and even, giving slightly with each step but holding firm. He looked up. The place they had arrived did not resemble anything he had prepared. 4 low buildings stretched out in clean rows, painted in light colors that reflected the sun rather than absorbing it. Windows were open. Screens visible. Curtains shifting slightly in the breeze. There were no signs of damage. No urgency in the way people moved. A few soldiers stood nearby, speaking quietly to one another, one of them holding a clipboard, another resting his hand casually against his belt. None of them rushed forward. None of them raised their voices. Carl stepped further away from the train, the space opening around him as more men disembarked, forming a loose line without being told to do so. It happened naturally, as if the structure still lived inside them even when it was not enforced from the outside. He turned his head slightly, and saw something that made him stop for half a second longer than he intended. Beyond the buildings, just past the low fence, there was a stretch of grass where 2 children were playing with a ball, their movements quick and careless, laughter carrying faintly through the air. They did not look toward the line of prisoners. They did not react at all. Their world continued, separate, untouched. Carl felt that same quiet pressure return, but now it was steadier, less sharp, as if it had found a place to settle. He stood there, surrounded by men who had expected one reality and stepped into another, and for the first time, the question forming in his mind was no longer what would happen next, but why everything before had been so certain when it had been so wrong. They were not marched. That was the first detail Carl noticed as the group began to move away from the train. No formation was forced onto them, no shouted cadence, no sharp correction when spacing shifted unevenly. Instead, a soldier at the front simply started walking, and the rest followed, the line forming on its own, guided more by instinct than command. Gravel crunched underfoot in a steady, muted rhythm, and the air carried a faint warmth that settled against the skin without pressing too hard. Carl kept his pace measured, eyes forward at first, then gradually allowing them to move again, taking in the space around him piece by piece. The buildings they passed were simple but maintained, their paint intact, their doors open, some with small signs posted beside them in clear lettering that he could not fully read but could recognize as organized, intentional. A screen door swung lightly on its hinges as someone passed through it, the sound soft, almost domestic. It did not belong in the place he had imagined. A soldier walked alongside the line, not close enough to crowd them, not far enough to ignore them, his presence steady but unobtrusive. At one point, he adjusted his cap, tilting it slightly back as if the sun had shifted, then continued walking without breaking stride. Carl noticed how easily the gesture came, how natural it looked, and for a moment, he found himself focusing on that small movement more than anything else. It was a detail that did not fit into the framework he had been given. Ahead, the path widened slightly, opening into a larger yard where the ground flattened into packed dirt, and patches of grass pushed through in uneven patterns. A wooden table stood near the center, papers arranged neatly across its surface, a pen resting at the edge as if placed there with care. A man stood behind it, sleeves rolled just past his wrists, his posture relaxed but attentive. As the first of the prisoners approached, he began speaking, his voice clear, steady, carried by habit rather than force. Carl could not catch every word, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was information. The kind of voice used to explain something, not to control it. The lines slowed as each man stepped forward in turn, repeating the process from earlier, names spoken, details recorded, movements guided with minimal instruction. When Carl reached the table, he stood still, waiting for the moment to change, for the pattern to break. It did not. The man looked up, met his eyes briefly, then lowered them to the paper. "Name?" he asked, the same word, the same calm delivery. "Carl Weber," he replied. The pen moved. A small mark. Nothing more. "You will be assigned quarters," the man said, pointing lightly toward a row of low buildings beyond the yard. "You will be given instructions." Shortly. The phrasing was simple, direct, and again, it lacked the edge Carl had expected. He stepped aside as indicated, moving toward the area without needing to be told twice. The ground beneath his boots shifted from dirt to wood as he reached the entrance of one of the buildings, the porch boards creaking slightly under his weight. Inside, the space was plain but ordered. Beds aligned in rows. Sheets folded neatly. Windows open, allowing air to move freely through the room. A faint scent of soap lingered, clean and unfamiliar. Carl stopped just inside the doorway, his hand brushing lightly against the frame as if to confirm its solidity. Behind him, others entered, filling the space quietly, each man reacting in his own way, some moving directly to a bed, others standing still, taking in the details with the same cautious disbelief. Carl stepped forward and sat on the edge of one of the beds, the mattress firm but even, supporting his weight without sinking. He placed his hands on his knees and looked ahead, not focusing on anything in particular, just allowing the moment to settle. Outside, the sounds continued. Voices. Footsteps. The distant echo of something metallic being set down. Nothing urgent. Nothing sharp. Just the steady continuation of a place functioning as it always had. And as Carl sat there, surrounded by order that required no force, he understood that the absence of what he had expected was no longer temporary. It was the reality itself. The room did not fill with noise the way Carl expected it to. No sudden conversations, no restless movement, no attempt to reclaim space through sound. Instead, the men settled into the room in a quiet, deliberate way, each one choosing a bed, placing what little they carried beside them, sitting or standing as if waiting for something that never arrived. Carl remained where he was, his hands still resting on his knees, his eyes moving slowly across the rows of beds, the symmetry of them, the intention behind their placement. Nothing here felt temporary. Nothing felt improvised. It was not the kind of place built in reaction. It was the kind of place prepared in advance. He leaned forward slightly, pressing his palms against the edge of the mattress, feeling the firmness again, grounding himself in something physical, something undeniable. Across the room, one of the men lay back cautiously, as if testing whether he would be corrected for it. No one spoke to him. No one reacted. He remained there, staring up at the ceiling, his expression unreadable, his body slowly releasing tension it had held for too long. Near the window, another man stood with his arms crossed, looking outside through the thin screen that shifted slightly with the breeze. Carl followed his gaze. Beyond the glass, the same steady world continued. A soldier walked past carrying a small stack of folded cloth, his steps even, his attention on the task in his hands. He disappeared behind the next building without once glancing inside. The absence of observation lingered. Carl stood up, the motion slow, controlled, and walked toward the window. The floor beneath his boots gave a faint sound with each step, not hollow, not fragile, just present. He stopped beside the man already there, leaving enough space between them, both of them looking out without acknowledging each other. The air moving through the screen carried a faint scent of grass and something else, something clean, something maintained. It did not carry smoke. It did not carry dust. It did not carry anything broken. A truck passed in the distance, its engine low, steady, followed by the sound of a door closing somewhere out of sight. Ordinary sounds. The kind that did not demand attention. Carl rested his hand lightly against the window frame, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath his fingers. No splinters. No cracks. It had been cared for. He let his hand fall back to his side. Behind him, footsteps approached, measured and unhurried. A soldier entered the room, stopping just inside the doorway, his posture straight but relaxed. He held a small stack of items in his arms, moving forward a few steps before placing them carefully on the nearest bed. "You will receive your bedding and basic items," he said, his voice clear but not raised. "There will be instructions later." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The statement existed on its own, complete. He began handing out the items one by one, moving from bed to bed, pausing briefly at each man, placing the folded fabric within reach. When he reached Carl, he extended the bundle without hesitation. Carl took it, the fabric light in his hands, neatly folded, the edges aligned with precision. He looked down at it for a moment, then back up, but the soldier had already moved on. No expectation of response. No need for acknowledgement. Just completion of a task. Carl returned to his bed and set the items down carefully, mirroring the care with which they had been given. He unfolded one edge slightly, revealing clean material, unmarked and used. He stopped, letting it fall back into place. Around him, the same quiet continued, but it was no longer uncertain. It had weight now. It had presence. Carl sat again, his posture less rigid than before, his shoulders lowering without permission. Outside, the light shifted slightly, the sun moving across the sky, casting longer shadows along the ground. Time was passing. Not controlled. Not forced. Just passing. And in that steady movement, Carl realized something that unsettled him more deeply than anything he had seen so far. Nothing here required them to be less than human. And no one had said it out loud. The light outside shifted again, softer now, stretching longer across the ground as the afternoon moved toward evening, and with it came a subtle change in the air, cooler, carrying a different weight that settled quietly into the room. Carl remained seated for a time, watching the way shadows formed along the floorboards, thin lines that slowly lengthened without interruption. No one announced the passing of time. No bell rang. No command marked the hour. It simply moved forward on its own. A sound came from outside, not loud, not sharp, but distinct enough to draw attention. A metal utensil striking against another, followed by the faint murmur of voices gathering somewhere beyond the building. The men in the room reacted without discussion, some standing, others pausing for a second as if confirming the direction of the sound before moving toward the door. Carl stood as well, his body following the same instinct, not driven by urgency but by curiosity that no longer felt dangerous. He stepped outside into the open air, the shift in temperature immediate, the breeze lighter now, carrying with it the scent of something warm, something prepared. He did not name it. Not yet. The yard had changed slightly. More movement now, but still without chaos. Men forming loose lines, not forced into place, simply aligning themselves in a way that made sense. Soldiers stood nearby, some speaking quietly, others observing without tension, their presence consistent but never pressing. Carl joined the line as it formed, standing behind another prisoner whose shoulders seemed less rigid than before, whose posture had softened in a way that mirrored his own. Ahead, a long table had been set up, simple and clean, with containers arranged in order, each one covered, each one waiting. A man stood behind the table, moving with practiced efficiency, lifting lids, portioning items onto trays, his motions steady, repeated, unhurried. When the first prisoner stepped forward, the exchange was brief. A tray placed. A nod given. No words that carried weight. Just completion. Carl watched carefully, his attention narrowing as his turn approached, his senses sharpening in a way that felt familiar, but the tension that usually accompanied it was absent. When he reached the front, he stepped forward and stopped, his eyes briefly meeting the man behind the table. The man did not hold the gaze. He simply placed a tray in Carl's hands, the surface warm, the contents arranged with care. Bread. Something cooked. Steam rising in thin, visible lines. Carl held it still for a second longer than necessary, the warmth transferring through the metal into his palms. He stepped aside, moving to a nearby bench, sitting down with the same measured motion he had used before. Around him, others did the same, the yard filling with the quiet sounds of people sitting, shifting, beginning to eat. Carl looked down at the tray. The food did not resemble what he had prepared himself to receive. It was not scarce. It was not uncertain. It was present. Real. He picked up a piece of bread, turning it slightly in his fingers, feeling its softness, the way it gave under slight pressure. He brought it closer, hesitated, then took a small bite. The taste registered immediately. Not diluted. Not stretched. Complete. He chewed slowly, his eyes unfocused for a moment as his body reacted before his thoughts could form. Around him, similar reactions unfolded in silence. A man across the table paused mid-motion, his hand still, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something quieter. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary again. The moment did not need explanation. It existed on its own. Carl swallowed, lowering the bread back to the tray, his hand steady but his thoughts no longer aligned with anything he had carried with him across the ocean. He looked up, his gaze moving across the yard, taking in the scene not as something temporary, not as something deceptive, but as something consistent, something that had not changed since he arrived. The soldiers moved the same way. The people worked the same way. The world continued without adjusting itself to the presence of the men who had expected it to be different. And as Carl sat there, holding a tray that contradicted everything he had been told, he realized that the hardest part was no longer understanding what he was seeing, but accepting that it had been real all along. The meal ended without announcement, the same way it had begun, gradually, quietly, each man finishing at his own pace, setting the tray aside with a soft sound that did not interrupt the space around him. Carl remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the bench, his gaze lowered but unfocused, as if the act of eating had shifted something deeper than hunger. Around him, the others began to stand, some carrying their trays back toward the collection point, others simply waiting, unsure if there was a correct order to follow. There was none. The system revealed itself through repetition, not enforcement. Carl stood, lifting his tray, feeling its weight now lighter, the warmth gone, replaced by something neutral, something complete. He walked toward the table, placing it where the others had placed theirs, aligning it without being told, adjusting it slightly until it matched the row. The motion felt instinctive. Familiar. But not imposed. He stepped back and turned, his eyes moving across the yard once more. The light had lowered further, the sky shifting into a softer tone, the edges of the buildings outlined in gold, shadows stretching longer across the ground. A few soldiers moved through the space, their voices low, their pace unchanged, as if the passing of the day required no adjustment from them. One of them paused near the fence, resting his arm along the top rail, looking out toward the distance where the land opened into fields that seemed to go on without end. He stood there for a moment, still, then pushed himself upright and walked on. Carl watched the movement, noting the ease of it, the absence of urgency, the absence of anything that needed to be proven. The yard began to empty slowly, men returning to the buildings in small groups or alone, the structure dissolving naturally as the moment passed. Carl followed, not because he was told, but because there was nowhere else to go, and more importantly, no reason to resist the direction of things. Inside, the room had changed again, not in its arrangement, but in its atmosphere. The beds were no longer just objects. They had been used. Claimed. The space held the presence of those who occupied it, a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer temporary in the way they had imagined. Carl moved to his bed and sat, the same motion, but now it carried less hesitation. He picked up the folded fabric he had been given earlier and unfolded it fully this time, spreading it across the mattress with deliberate care, smoothing the edges with his hands until it lay flat. The action was simple, almost automatic, but it carried a weight he had not expected. It was not preparation for survival. It was preparation for rest. He paused, his hands still against the fabric, feeling its texture, its clean surface, untouched by anything before him. Outside, the last of the daylight faded slowly, the sound softening, the movement thinning until only the occasional footstep or distant voice remained. No alarms. No orders. Just the end of a day that had unfolded without force. Carl lay back, his body lowering onto the bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above him, the lines of the wood visible in the dimming light. He breathed in, slow, steady, the air filling his lungs without resistance, without the tightness that had followed him across the ocean. For a long moment, he did not move. He did not think in the way he had before, searching for meaning, for explanation. Instead, he allowed the absence of those questions to exist. The silence around him was not empty. It was full. Full of everything that had not happened. No one had shouted. No one had struck. No one had taken anything from him. The day had passed, complete in its quiet, complete in its contradiction. And as Carl closed his eyes, the realization settled into place with a clarity that did not need words. They had prepared for something else. And what they found required them to become something else in return.